Hello. Today we have a great podcast that cuts across lots of disciplines and histories and even countries. That's right, we're talking about the history of hockey. I think and hope that you will learn as much from this history of hockey and the history of the Canadian-Soviet matchup as I did. Also, as this is our first podcast of the month, it is part of our AskHistorians book giveaway. The winner this month will get to pick from a book about hockey, A Fascinating History of Impotence by Angus McLaren called Impotence, A Cultural History, that I am reading right now, or a historical fiction book. The winner this month is Eric H. Congratulations, Eric. I'll send you an email. For the rest of you, come on by Patreon and help support the show. For $1 a month, you get a spin on the book giveaway. For $5, it is 2, and 10 for more. If you want to donate more than that a month, get in touch, and maybe we can curate for you from our book list. That's at patreon.com/AskHistorians. All funds go towards supporting our mission of public history. And now, here's the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I am very pleased to be your host today, Brian Watson. And today we are very lucky to be joined by Kaiser Matthias, who is a flared user on Ask Historians on the very disparate topics of 20th century Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and hockey. It's the last topic we're here to talk about today. He's better known to his friends and family as Matt Lerner, and he's here to talk about the history of hockey, just in time for Christmas. Matt has a master's degree in European, Russian, and Eurasian studies from Carleton University with a focus on Soviet nationality policy in Abkhazia. Did I say that right?
You did.
All right, great. Well, first thing first, welcome to the Ask Historians podcast, Matt.
Oh, it's great to have me. I've been looking forward to doing this for a while, so here we are.
Yeah, I'm very pleased for how I managed to get you on. I actually usually like to start by asking guests how they got interested in the topic of their research. But first, I think I'd like to ask you about how you got interested in 20th century Europe and the Caucasus first before we go to hockey.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, 20th century Eastern Europe. My family, mostly my mother's side, is originally from what's now modern Ukraine. So growing up, I was always curious about like where they came from, what they were all about, and never really getting an answer. I kind of just looked into it as I got older, and it just became something I was really fascinated about. Caucasus came out kind of oddly. I ended up, after I got my undergrad degree, I went to Georgia to teach English for a few months, and I just fell in love with the country and came back and wrote my master's degree on the region, and I've continued looking into it since then.
That's really interesting. What about the 20th century got you interested? Were you just interested in that because that like one happened just before?
Yeah, like I said, like my great-grandparents came to Canada just after the First World War. So like at that time, as I was told growing up, the borders shifted a lot. So I never really knew if they were Polish or Ukrainian or Russian or whatever. And I was just really interested in how that all worked because it sounded odd that borders shifted so much that I couldn't tell where they're from. And as it turns out, that's pretty much how it worked. Their borders shifted a lot, and I still, even all these years later, have no idea really what they were, although I'm pretty sure they were Ukrainian.
It's kind of interesting, like how the whole narrative, people coming over from different parts of the country, really changes.
It is.
So, did you get interested in hockey because you're Canadian? Is that right?
Pretty much. I mean, I don't really know a time when hockey wasn't really part of my life. I mean, I'm from the west coast of Canada where it doesn't actually snow or get cold during winter, so I didn't play ice hockey growing up. I just played street hockey year round, but still, since I was young, I was watching hockey on TV and always following the players and the local team, and as bad as they are, and just continue doing that, and it keeps up now.
What about it is so interesting to you specifically? What's the first time you can remember watching hockey?
Oh, geez. I'd like to say the first time I saw it would be the 1994 Stanley Cup Finals. I would have been about 6 years old, and that's when Vancouver, the Canucks, my local team, made a run to the final, which was unexpected. And although honestly, I don't really remember too much about it. I just remember the aftermath, and just it was a big deal where I'm from. And watching also like Pavel Bure, who came over in the early 90s to Vancouver from Russia, he was one of the flashiest players in the 1990s in hockey, and just having him around there, he was by far my favorite player, and just watching that happen and the speed and the fun of it all, and it just, I don't know, and being all around you, it's hard to not like it.
So it's you think it comes more from you just being Canadian, it's just like a part of your national identity in a sense, not anything else that's particularly interesting
to an extent. I mean, at the same time, like I should mention, like my mother's a big hockey fan, like she grew up watching it, but my father, he's totally indifferent. I mean, he's probably watched 5 hockey games in his life, if that many. So like it's definitely more on my mother's side that I grew up watching that stuff, but still like all my friends like played hockey and stuff. I played it on the street, like I said, growing up every day pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
It's a part of your life, yeah, really in Canada. I mean, it's hard not to you either love it or you hate it because it's so ubiquitous.
It's very interesting to me because I'm from New Hampshire, which is up there in New England and Maine, and
Yeah.
hockey is really huge there. It's a big part. We have a lot of French Canadian population in Manchester, especially because of the mills. But I just never really got interested in hockey. But I always kind of vaguely followed it. I always kind of knew what was going on with it vaguely.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it is. Like for people who aren't fans, right? Like they'll still even be able to know like some things are going on or like the big names and stuff. But yeah, it's excuse me, it's just a part of life up here. I mean, things happen. Like there's billboards in one city recently. Because the ownership is not too popular, some fans bought a billboard and like saying, "Sell the team." Like we want a new owner who actually cares. Like it's that much of a big deal up here.
Yeah. What's the history of hockey in Canada, or the history of hockey in general? Where does it come from?
That's a good question. I mean, no one actually knows the origins of hockey. I mean, ball and stick games, which hockey effectively is just on ice, go back to the start of humanity. Right? I mean, there's Egyptian drawings with people playing ball and stick games, and I mean, once people started skating on ice, they brought the sports onto the ice. So like proto games of hockey have been around forever. I mean, there's paintings from like the Renaissance era of Netherlands showing people playing games that look a lot like hockey. Although it's probably more related to bandy, which is a similar sport just played on a far larger ice surface, like soccer-sized ice surface and a lot more players. But narrowing it down, like modern hockey as we would understand it dates to about the 1870s in Canada. I mean, by that point, there's actual what people would call hockey as a sport existing and being played in Canada.
So it definitely started in Canada, as far as we can really tell.
Yeah, what we would call hockey today, yeah, it's pretty much started in Canada. I mean, there's some people who argue that maybe started in England or America or anything, but most hockey historians will say it started in Canada. What part of Canada? Again, that's a matter of debate. I mean, it's
a matter of heated debate.
It is, actually. There's three major cities that are like candidates for it. It's Montreal in Quebec, Halifax in Nova Scotia, and then Kingston in Ontario. So each of them has a strong point to say like they're played the first games of hockey. But I mean, no one's gonna be able to tell you for certain where it first happened.
But I mean, half the fun is arguing about it, right?
Oh, exactly. And just being able to like research it. I mean, there's people who are actually quite dedicated to looking into the history of it, and the fact that they keep looking into it, it's kind of neat. Like they keep pushing it up and like looking at how it happened. It's quite interesting hearing the debates about it.
Yeah, it really is. Did the first games like have like the same set of rules that they do now?
Not at all. Not at all. The first game, like the IHF, the International Ice Hockey Federation, has declared like the first game of what we could actually call ice hockey. They have a date for it. It's March 3rd, 1875, and it happened in Montreal. Mm-hmm. That game would be totally unfamiliar for people today. It's like today's game, it's 5 skaters and a goalie on each side. You can pass the puck forward. There's lines on the ice. There's hitting. There's padding. There's helmets. That game in 1875 was 9 players on each side. You couldn't pass forwards. You had to pass sideways or backwards like in rugby. They didn't wear helmets. They didn't wear any gear or anything. They wore maybe like a long sweater and some long pants. That's about it. The goals they had were just 2 poles in the ice. There's no marking on the ice. And there was no boards on the ice. So people could walk like right up to the edge of the ice and get hit by the players if they really wanted to. So yeah, it's a very different sport than it was 140 years ago.
143. We're coming up for 150 years. And
yeah, it's getting close, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. What led it to be more formalized, I guess? I mean, that's almost 150 years of history. But how would you condense it in that sense?
Well, I guess the easy answer. Well, there's 2 things I would say. One, it got really popular. I mean, people liked hockey, and 2, there's money to be made, and it's easy to make money when there's organized rules and regulations for things. So, and just the various things like the rule, like the skating and the lines and the passing, that all came either to improve this type of game being played or to make more money, and it just slowly has evolved, very slowly actually. I mean, some of these changes have only occurred in the last 40, 50 years.
Mm-hmm. If you were to explain to somebody like me that knows almost nothing about hockey or how it's played or the rules, what would you say would be the kind of like the most important developments in the rules to that impact the game today?
A couple things. One, the fact that they can pass the puck forward now, like unlike rugby, like the change is just like when rugby started passing forward and became like football, like American Canadian football. I mean, those are two different sports compared to rugby, but they were all originally the same thing. I mean, that's huge. The second thing I would say is just the introduction of the curved stick. I mean, originally the hockey sticks, they were very flat blades. They did not have a curve at all. Then in the 1960s, some players started curving the stick, and that made the puck, the shots they did, just incredibly more accurate and stronger. And that also led to goaltenders starting to wear masks, because up until 1959, no goalie ever wore a mask, which sounds crazy today because, I mean, you look at what happens.
Oh my God.
Yeah, these guys are doing it. And one night, one of the players got hit in the face and nearly tore his face in half, and he refused to go back on unless he wore a mask. Between that and the forward pass and the curved sticks, it became pretty much modern hockey as it is today.
So the first sticks, they weren't curved; they were just sticks.
They were just a flat, like it had like the curve, like the L shape on it, but like the L, like the actual like blade itself did not curve at all. It was just flat, so you could shoot forwards or backwards. It'd be the same thing. But today, like the stick's curved depending on what way you hold the stick, and like if you try to shoot backwards, it's going to be a lot harder than shooting forwards. And just the difference that makes is that like you can aim your shot a lot better with the curved stick.
That's really interesting. I actually never would have thought of. I mean, the safety gear makes sense. It makes sense just looking at like when you're throwing a hockey puck at 80, 90 miles an hour at somebody's face.
Try closer to, like, some of the guys get over 100 miles an hour if they're really put itself into it. Yeah, and there's also the oft-told rumor from the 60s, one of the best goal scorers. There's a rumor that he shot up to 120 miles an hour, although that's been disputed because of faulty shot clocks. But the fact is that like he shot crazy speeds, and like you don't want to get your bare face in that. Like they were gonna kill somebody at that point. So
yeah. So I guess that makes absolute sense that they start using face masks and other protective gear. But the thing about the hockey stick is like something that hadn't really occurred to me. It's kind of like how the development of the technology of hockey almost. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, like it wasn't a thing anyone ever thought about until one guy just started doing it. I mean, he did it. He saw a lot of success, and suddenly everyone was doing it because it made it a lot easier. Crazy. It just huge things happen so simple like that.
Yeah, it really is. And the other thing I think was explained to me as a kid when I was watching hockey, but I still don't think it was explained very well by my dad and his friends who were several beers in. Why do they allow fighting in hockey?
Well, that's the thing. Fighting technically is not in the rules. I mean, players get a penalty for the fighting after they do it, but the fact is they are allowed to like do it, and they're not going to get kicked out or expelled from the game. But I mean, it's physicality has been a part of hockey since the first game was played. I mean, you look at reports from these early games, guys are getting bashed on the head with a stick. And remember, these guys didn't wear helmets, so when they get bashed on the head, they're getting their heads split open and stitches and cracked faces and all that. So fighting's just been a part of it. I mean, fighting was not as popular early on. Like the stick work was much more prevalent at that point. But since about the 1970s, fighting really took off in hockey, and like that's when you get like the rough and tumble hockey with the Rodney Dangerfield. I went to a boxing match and a hockey game broke out. But it's also like hockey, like the NHL, the National Hockey League, who's like the top league in the world, kind of realized that one, a lot of people aren't big into the fighting because, I mean, you're watching these, they got to the point where they're getting guys who can barely skate but can use their fists. So like that's detracting from guys who can score goals, and people much prefer to watch goals being scored.
Mm-hmm.
So like they kind of backtracked a bit and kind of like made it a little more difficult. And two, it's just fighting has backtracked a bit in the last 20 years or so. It's just more players. There's more emphasis on skill and speed now. So like you can't have these guys who plod around and just punch everyone. They got to like be able to keep up with the pace, and a lot of the fighters just can't do it anymore.
Is it true that there, I guess not very recently, but in the near past, there was more of a strategy to the fighting? It wasn't just like sort of random fighting.
Oh yeah, it's always been there's pretty much an unwritten code. I mean, there's actually been a book written about, I think almost 20 years ago now. I think it's actually called The Code, about unwritten rules of like hockey and fighting. It's for the most part, these big goons, as they're called, aren't going to go fight like the top scorer in the other team. I mean, they do that, it's just going to cause a ruckus. So they'll only fight like other fighters in the game. I mean, there's the odd time when like a smaller, like skilled guy is going to lose his temper and fight somebody, but those are rare occasions. It's mostly just fighters pairing off against other fighters, and they're going to hit the other fighters and chase each other around on the ice. So, like they're the skaters, the scorers, and then they're going to worry about actually playing the game. The fighters are just going to worry about fighting, and that's largely what happened for the last 40 years.
Is the fighter like an actual term, or is it just a descriptive word?
it's not a position per se, but I mean, it's an unofficial term. I mean, like, you'll have like a guy, he'll be clearly described in any like hockey reporting as a fighter, and like you say that to a hockey person, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. Just the same, like you said, like a guy is a goal scorer, like his primary thing is he scores goals, or another term is a playmaker, a guy who like does all the passing and helps set up the goal scorer. Just like a fighter is just the same type of thing.
So what does the history of the fighting in the game kind of tell us about the audience watching the games?
For a large part, like you got to remember, hockey started in the late 1800s, was a very interesting time for like social development. I mean, you got all this transition from the Industrial Revolution to like more urbanized setting. So you got all these like white collar workers who are like losing their almost term is like their aggressiveness, their masculinity, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add in Canada, which Canada's like developed, even throughout its history, it's like got this reputation of being like the wild wilderness, fur traders and people who live in igloos and they hunt like caribou and all that. So like you have these Canadian people who like living in offices and they're realizing they're not living up to what they're supposed to be like, and it's kind of become an outlet to watch like some tough guys fight around, or even like go and play the hockey themselves, and just have an outlet to like exert some masculinity and some physicality. And I think it just kind of grew from there.
And so that I guess that would be Canada was more founded as more of an independent entity in 1867, right? So that would be right about the time hockey was becoming more popular and formalized. So it kind of exists right at the very beginning of your national identity.
Exactly. I mean, Canada's starting to slowly. I mean, that time for a long time afterwards, Canada was very much tied to the United Kingdom and the British identity. I mean, a lot of the Canadians at that time would call themselves Brits more than Canadians. The idea of creating a separate Canadian identity grew in part because hockey was something that Canada was clearly different from Britain. I mean, the Brits never really got into hockey. I mean, even now it's a very niche sport in the United Kingdom. But like that's one thing the Canadians here, they use that as an outlet to show that they're different. They didn't play rugby. I mean, rugby was popular to an extent. That's the sport that the Brits really got into for the same idea as rugby and soccer, or football as they call it. Like a running joke among Canadians is the Canadian identity is pretty much just not being American. I mean, that's a lot of people don't like that idea, but I mean, that's very much tied into what our identity is. It's just not being like the Americans. I mean, again, hockey served that purpose as well. I mean, hockey's a popular sport in America, but it's definitely no higher than number 4 behind basketball, baseball, and football. And soccer, I mean, is right up there, is coming up behind it too. So, yeah. But hockey, I mean, up here, youth participation in hockey is declining recently to soccer, but still, people are going to watch hockey. Hockey arenas across the country sell it every night. People are watching on TV all the time.
How does the NHL get founded? What does it mean that there's a National Hockey League, and how does that ties into the development of hockey itself?
Oh, again, that's a long, complicated story there, but I'll try to summarize it quick. Again, hockey was amateur in the beginning, as all sports were in like 1800s. They're all amateur sports, and just various amateur leagues just infighting amongst themselves slowly ended up turning professional in 1909. Or 1907 was the first pro league in Canada. The NHL itself was founded in 1917, and a funny story of that, it was made as a protest because 4 of the owners in one league didn't like the 5th owner in their league, so they all left him in his league by himself and formed a new league just so they didn't have to have legal challenges with him. As one of the owners at that time said, in the day after they founded the NHL, we didn't leave Eddie, the owner they hated, or we didn't expel him. He's there in his own league all by himself. The NHL just kind of was founded as a protest to kick out one old owner, and it was just a successor, the latest incarnation of a succession of 5 or 10 leagues dating back to early 1880s, I suppose. And it just managed to have the staying power somehow, and just had its 100th anniversary last year, and it was a big deal.
So that, I think, transitions into my next question, which is kind of like the focus of the podcast today, which is the 1972 Summit Series, which was this tournament between Canada and the USSR. How did hockey reach the Soviet Union?
Hockey reached the Soviet Union actually relatively late. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, bandy, a similar sport played on ice, has been played in Russia and then the Soviet Union for years beforehand. Like, again, just the fact that Russia's very cold in winter, much like Canada, so like they have a lot of ice, and sticks and balls games are popular everywhere for every reason. So like bandy was popular. But hockey itself didn't actually really take off until the post-Second World War era. I mean, part of that's because the early Soviet Union was very much against sports. They considered it a bourgeois pastime. and they were very adamant against it. But something changed in that era that they decided that they're going to show that the socialist way of life was great at sports, and that's the way to show the rest of the world that socialism is the way to go, not capitalism. And they introduced themselves into a lot of sports and joined the Olympic movement and all that. So the first Soviet hockey league started in 1946.
Wow.
Although it actually had a really tragic beginning, because in the first year, the Soviet Union, unlike Canada, where we have like club teams set up, they had teams organized by like ministries or like local like factories. So like you had a team, the Red Army had a team, the Air Force had a team, some tractor factories had teams, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the first year, the Air Force team was flying back, I think flying to or from Moscow, and their plane crashed on the way in between, and all but I think two other players who weren't on the plane died. And this was the best team in the league.
Wow.
Not in part because not the owner, but like the leader, or lack of a better word, like chairman of the team was Vasily Stalin, the son of Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
So he used his connections to bring in all the best hockey players who were actually originally football, soccer players, or bandy players, and he just gave them sticks and said, "You're hockey players now." Fortunately, they all died on that crash, except one of the best early Soviet players who was fortunately hurt that day and missed the flight.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Soviet Union started in the mid-40s, and they didn't join international competition until 1954 when they first played the World Championship. And this is only, like I said, 8 years after they first played a league game, and they came out into the world. No one had really seen them because people don't visit the Soviet Union in that time. And they came out and made the final game, and they almost beat Canada. Or no, they did beat Canada in that game, which shocked the world because Canada had won something like 30 of the last 34 World Championships. And suddenly people realized the Soviets were actually a team that could be good.
Yeah, I was going to say that must have been so interesting. I was thinking in terms of time, the Canadians have been doing this for almost for 100 years at that point. So the fact that the Russians had adopted it, or sorry, the Soviets had adopted it so fast, must have been really fascinating. Were any contemporary Canadian politicians or I guess sport player make comments about this or observations about it?
Yeah, it was the 1954 loss. I mean, at the time, I should clarify first, the top Canadian players weren't allowed to play in international tournaments because they was still strictly amateur.
Mm-hmm.
So all the NHL players who were pro players weren't allowed to play, but the Soviets, because the Soviet Union and all the communist bloc countries, their players technically weren't sports players. They were, for like example, lieutenants in the military, so they just happened to play hockey on the side, even though the military job was just for show. So like these guys were effectively pros. So like they're playing against the top amateurs, which Canadian amateurs weren't bad, but they're not pros. But yes, when they first beat the Canadians, it became a big deal, and Canada actually sent out, created like an all-star team, so to speak. Before that, they sent club teams. They created an all-star team, which won the next year to like kind of stop the Russians. But I shouldn't say Russians, the Soviets. But the next few years, the Soviets came back and just kind of dominated, and Canada was just not able to keep up with it. And it became a big national crisis, actually. So in the early 1960s, the Canadian government actually sanctioned the promotion of a national team for the first time. Instead of just sending the top amateur team, which won a trophy every year, they select the best players from across the country, send them to the University of British Columbia, which had a rink set up for it, and they trained for a few months before going off to Europe to play the World Championships.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak any more about how Canadians were impacted by the Russians embracing the sport and doing so well at it?
I think just it kind of shocked the Canadians. I mean, we'd been winning, like hockey first was played at the Olympics in 1920, but except for 1936, which is an aberration because the British team won the gold medal because they just had a bunch of Canadians. Canada won every gold medal in hockey from 1920 to 1952.
Wow.
But then the Russians first joined in 1956, and until 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed, except for 2 years, Russia won every gold medal.
Oh, I had no idea.
And Canada did not win a gold medal. So it kind of shocked Canadians, the fact that we were no longer the top team by far in hockey. I mean, some other countries like Czechoslovakia became quite good in the 1940s as well at hockey, and they even won a couple gold medals at the World Championships. But I mean, those were aberrations. Canada was clearly by far the top team. I mean, they'd go over and just steamroll these European teams and just kind of do it as a fun little vacation for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So when we suddenly had like a real competition, it kind of shocked everybody, and like there was like concern almost.
So what did the 72 summit, why did that become more significant? Because it's taking place against the backdrop of the Cold War? Has it become more national?
I think that is a large part of it, yeah. But I think also, like I said, keep in mind, like the Canadian teams were all amateurs and the Soviets were quasi-professionals. So like, remember, the best Canadians were all professionals, so like they could never play against the Soviet players, and it became the point is instead of accepting the fact that Canada had real competition, the argument was we're not sending our best players. If we sent our best, we'd steamroll them like easily, just like we did in the 1930s or 20s. So starting in the late 60s, it was actually an attaché at the Canadian Embassy in Moscow who got in contact with a Russian news reporter and started the idea of it. He said, why don't we try and set up a thing for the NHL to play some of the best Soviet players? And it just kind of steamrolled from there, and they got each other's governments involved, and suddenly they're setting this up. So in 1972, the NHL agreed they'll play an 8-game series of an all-star team of NHL players against the best Soviet players, and to be 4 games in Canada and 4 games in Moscow.
Can you take us through those stages, like that first half of the summit, which took place in Canada, right?
Yeah.
So can you take us through kind of like how it played out and how the first few games went?
Yeah, of course. So like there's 4 games in Canada. They were played in Montreal, successfully Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. And all Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver all had NHL teams. Winnipeg didn't, which is interesting that they got to host a game. And in the lead up, I mean, Canadian newspaper reporters were all just saying it's going to be an 8-0 sweep for Canada. One of the most famous lines from this is a columnist who said, and I'll quote, "If the Russians win 1 game, I will eat this column shredded at high noon in a bowl of borscht on the front steps of the Russian embassy." And I'll close up this talk here with him with what happened with that afterwards, just to show that he ended up living up to his words there. But yeah, so the first game, everyone is expecting Canada to swamp them, and the Canadian Prime Minister dropped the puck for the first game, the honorary puck drop. Canada actually scored a goal, I think, less than a minute into the game, and everyone thought this is how it's going to be for the next 8 games. And so everyone just kind of like got complacent. And also the Soviets, I keep calling them Russians. I mean, they were mostly Russian players, but the Soviets scored a goal right away, and then they scored a couple more, and they ended up winning the first game 7-3 and really embarrassing Canada. Unfortunately, the second game, Toronto, Canada came back, and having woken up, they managed to win that game. Although they tied the game in Winnipeg, not playing too great. And then Vancouver was really bad. They were apparently really sloppy during the entire game. They just couldn't handle it, and the Soviets won it, leaving Canada leading with the series lead 2-1 and 1 tied. And after that game in Vancouver, it's another famous line in Canadian history. Phil Esposito, one of the team leaders on the Canadian team, gave an interview on the ice. And he said he was really disappointed because the Canadian fans were booing them as they left the ice. And he was trying to explain, like, just these guys are playing their hearts out. I mean, the video clip of him is he's just covered in sweat. He's panting. He's exhausted. And he's just saying, like, these guys all came out because they love Canada, and they really don't like the fact that Canadians are, like, booing them because they're just outmatched, and they didn't realize they were going to get outmatched.
So we've what you said, you tied 1 and scored 2. That was the score.
Yeah, at the first 4 games, the Soviets had won 2 games, the Canadians had won 1 game, and 1 game was tied. So
wow,
it was not looking too good.
So then they go from there to the USSR. What cities do they play there?
They all played all 4 games of the same arena, the Luzhniki Arena in Moscow. It's by far the most famous arena in Moscow or in the whole Soviet Union. And there they had it was a very large crowd again of very stoic Soviet citizens who don't really cheer and celebrate, but also about 2,000 Canadians were allowed to make the trip, and they were very loud and very rambunctious because after they heard Esposito's plea, they kind of like turned it around and became actual supporters. And one of the famous chants throughout the 4 games in Moscow was the Canadian fans saying, "Da Canada, niet Soviet." And you could actually see, like on video clips, Soviet soldiers all around the arena just looking very uncomfortable surrounding these Canadian fans because they don't know how to deal with this. It's just not something that happens in the Soviet Union.
That's fascinating. It's like this. It's kind of like a cultural clash happening right on television.
It really was. For a lot of Canadians, I'm sure it's probably their first experience with seeing Moscow. I mean, they'd never really seen the Soviet Union or Moscow, and they're seeing it like this and seeing how the Soviet people are, is even more so for the Canadians who made the trek over there. I mean, I'm sure they didn't get to see a full glance of what it is. It's probably similar if someone went to North Korea today. You're not going to see or talk to a person there, but just seeing things like that, it's going to be an eye-opening experience.
Before we talk about the last 4 games, was there any do we know of any commentary in Russia and what they were feeling and thinking and seeing about the games, how their feeling was going into the last 4 games?
They weren't as invested in the series as Canada was. I mean, the Soviets obviously cared that they wanted to win the series, but I mean, they just considered it an exhibition. I mean, the Soviets they trained year round. They played games against countries all across the world, and they just treated it largely as just another series and just showing they were going to be able to prove once and for all that they were the best team in the world. I mean, they heard the arguments that they weren't playing real Canadian players, and after having won the series in Canada, they felt they could finally just prove that it's not a fluke. They are actually a good team. They're not just beating up amateur players.
So it's in Canada, it becomes like this big rallying national point, but in Russia, it's just another year playing hockey.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, they're much more invested in winning the Olympic Games and winning the World Championships. I mean, the gold medals counted. Beating out of shape Canadian players is not what they're worried about.
That I can kind of see why the Russians might have been a little bit more uncomfortable than Canadians attending the Lions. Well, we don't really care that much. So what happens in let's say the next 2 games? Does Canada finally make a comeback?
Not in Game 5. The Soviets actually won the 5th game as well, the first game in Moscow. So they had a commanding 3-1 lead with 1 tie again, of course. So Canada was really desperate. I mean, they wanted to be able to show that they could win the series, and they were down 3-1 at this point.
Wow. And then in the next game, they finally start making a comeback?
They did, actually. Canada starts the comeback. They win Game 6 on a game-winning goal by Paul Henderson, which is a name that's going to come up a few more times here.
Mm-hmm. And what happens in the next 2 games?
Again, Game 7, Paul Henderson, who scores the game-winning goal. I mean, Paul Henderson was not really a star player in the NHL before this. I mean, he was more of a middle-of-the-pack player, not one of your top guys, but a guy you'd like to have on your team. But suddenly he scores 2 of the 3 game-winning goals for Canada. And then Game 8, it's tied till the last few minutes of the game, and actually at the second intermission there of 3, in between the second and third period, when it's tied, Canada and the Soviet officials meet up and they're trying to decide if this game ends tied, who's going to win the series. And the Soviets actually argue that based on international rules, because they'd scored more goals, if the game ended tied, the Soviets would have declared themselves winners. Well, Canada said, no, this is ridiculous. We need to have an actual winner for this game. We're not letting you tie a game and declare yourself winners. But fortunately, in one of the greatest, at least in Canada's opinion, sporting moments ever, 34 seconds left in this game, Paul Henderson again somehow scores the game-winning goal. And it's been immortalized on Canadian stamps, on TV series, commercials. Foster Hewitt, the legendary Canadian hockey broadcaster, had the famous words, Henderson has scored for Canada on this clip. And if you ever watch the clip, the entire Canadian team jumps off the ice, and the trainers and the coaches, all that, they all go and hug Henderson at the other end of the ice, even though there's still 34 seconds left in the game. And it's a huge thing. All the Canadian fans are cheering and everything. It's up there with the Miracle on Ice for Americans who understand what that means. Canadians argue that Paul Henderson's goal is even bigger because it happened first, and it happened after an 8-game series, not just a 1-game fluke.
So that's I think this wasn't in my original question, but I think we need to stop for a moment and ask what's the deal with Paul Henderson? Where did he come from? He just had himself a really incredible 3 weeks in September 1972. I mean, he was never, like I said, a great player. I mein, some people have argued he should go in the Hockey Hall of Fame, but I mean, his career outside of that 1 month is not spectacular by any means. I mean, nothing against Paul Henderson. He's a great guy, and he's very nice. He's actually been, I believe, quite sick the last few years and not doing too well health-wise. But the fact is, I mean, outside of that, he's legendary for one reason, and the fact is he scored 3 game-winning goals, which is incredible. I mean, no one could have called that before the series started. Yeah, back to back.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads me into my next question, and I guess I can kind of ask.
Yeah.
wants to see aftermath of all this. Paul Henderson probably becomes like a little national hero in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure if he drank, he probably would have never had to buy another drink in a bar in Canada until today. I mean, he's just legendary. But I mean, the first obvious fact is that the Soviets proved that they were just as good as everyone thought they were. I mean, they managed to take the NHL to literally the last minute of the last game and showed that they could compete. And even then, Canada didn't continue playing international hockey at that point. Because of the amateur rules, Canada actually was in the middle of a boycott that lasted from 1970 to 1977 because they were arguing that the Soviets were professionals, and they only rejoined international hockey when the rules were changed and they started allowing professionals to some degree. But I think another legacy is just on the ice in hockey itself. I mean, the Soviets, they had a lot of unique training and skills in the gameplay. I mean, they were ones who, because of the lack of rinks in the Soviet Union, especially in the 40s, they really emphasized dryland training like running and jogging and like weightlifting. Canadian players, they didn't do any of that until the 70s. They showed up to training camp, and those few weeks were when they got in shape. They spent the summer out on the beach, drinking beer, smoking, eating all the fun foods. But they started to really emphasize that. Now you look at players today. I mean, these guys are training year long. They're running year long. They're doing all this off-ice training. Same thing with the actual ice play. The Soviets, unlike Canada, which emphasized physicality and fighting, the Soviets, they've never been into that. The Russians, even today, are not a fighting, there's no fighting in Russian hockey today still. They're more into the skating and the passing and emphasizing the skill set of hockey. And that really became popular later on, not so much in the early 70s, but some teams, some forward-thinking coaches really started to emphasize that. And the results showed, the coaches that emphasized that suddenly started winning a lot of championships. And today, you could argue that some of the legacies are still seen in hockey today with the fact that there's a lot of emphasis on passing instead of just brute force. And also, just the last thing is eventually, not so much in the 70s, but it just started the slow trickle of Europeans being accepted into the NHL. I mean, the NHL up until the mid 70s was almost an exclusively Canadian league. I mean, for most of the years there was one or two non-Canadians, and they were American. But because the fact was they watching the Canadians play these European teams, they just thought the Europeans were not very good enough or couldn't handle the physicality. But the fact the Soviets did this, it started to make people realize that maybe some of these Europeans can come over. Although, due to the communist aspect of the Soviet Union, the Russian players were not invited yet, which I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit here.
I was going to say the Russians kind of had a big influence in creating the resulting history of hockey, but I bet you couldn't find very many Canadians that would be willing to admit that hockey now is very Russian.
No, I mean, even now there's a famous Canadian commentator on TV on the Canadian national broadcaster, Don Cherry, who's he's got to be in his mid 80s now. He used to be a coach in the NHL in the mid 70s, and his big thing was physicality, and he's, depending on your opinion of Don Cherry, he's either a wise old coach who's a little beyond his years, or he's a racist, xenophobic hater of everything who's not English Canadian. I mean, if you're not an English Canadian player, there's something he's criticized about you in his 30 years on TV. But he's very much of the old school style of thinking of hockey, and his views are definitely a little outdated. But I mean, every Saturday night he still talks on TV, and every Saturday night you can be sure that any Canadian fan knows what Don Cherry said and what his opinions are on things.
What can we draw from that sort of history about how hockey clubs kind of reflect the national concerns behind them? Can you see the people changing their opinions of hockey as a sport and hockey as a national identity? Can you see that in the local clubs too?
I think to an extent, yeah. I mean, might have alluded earlier, hockey originally started an upper class sport. I mean, back in the late 1800s, only the really wealthy upper class or upper middle class had both the time and the money to go play some leisurely sports. I mean, everyone else was busy working in factories or working on the farms. They're not exactly going to have the time to go take off for a Wednesday night and go play hockey. But I mean, that kind of shifted. So if you look on the Summit Series team, I mean, the best player arguably in Canada was Phil Esposito, who came from a working class Italian immigrant family and grew up playing hockey on a pond. Conversely, the goaltender on the Canadian team was Ken Dryden, who actually took a year off in the middle of the 1970s from playing on championship teams in the NHL to go finish his law degree. He already had a degree from Cornell University, and he later retired and ended up in politics and was a one-time minister in the Canadian government and a candidate for one of the leading political parties here. So, I mean, the fact that you have like Phil Esposito, who's a working class guy from an Italian immigrant family, and Ken Dryden, who's from a much more wealthier, well-off family, and ended up doing what he did, just shows that like it didn't matter where you're from. People were fond of you and enjoyed you on any side, and it was no longer just a rich white man's sport at that point.
This is kind of a related question, and if you don't have the resources for it, that's perfectly fine. But how does hockey or the popularity of hockey kind of develop among women? Because I don't really feel like women are very well or nationally represented in hockey. I know there's the Women's Hockey League, yes?
Yeah. Well, actually, again, in the early days of hockey, like in the early 20th century, women's hockey is actually quite popular in Canada. I mean, there's some teams there that were quite well renowned and quite popular, but just as many things for women, it kind of decreased in that era for a few decades, unfortunately, until the post-Second World War, and I guess arguably the baby boomer generation kind of reunited it. I mean, starting in like the late 80s, I would argue women's hockey kind of became a big thing in Canada again, and a lot more young girls started playing hockey and women played hockey. I mean, the first World's Women's Championship only started in 1990, but it's become quite popular now. I mean, and it joined the Olympics finally in 1998.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's still definitely a North American dominated sport, I mean, Canada and the US have won every gold medal in women's Olympic hockey and every world championship. But the fact is, like, you look at Canada, like, women's hockey is obviously not as supported as like NHL teams, but it's still quite popular. I mean, some of the top women's players, people know the name, like Hayley Wickenheiser, who's arguably the greatest women's hockey player of all time, and she's Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
She's quite well known across, at least in hockey circles, and probably in non-hockey circles in Canada if you talk to the right people. But some of those names are popular. I mean, it's not as popular, but I mean, women's sport in general is quite different than men's sport in that regard. But I would say it's, compared to other women's sports in Canada, it's quite up there.
Did you have any? I have like a final question, but I was wondering if you had anything more to say about how the impacts of the 1972 summit still kind of reverberate forward, or how the new people getting involved in hockey and how it develops afterwards. Any final thoughts on that?
Like development in what regards? I guess.
Just did you have any final thoughts about like how the Russian players coming over, or how new national identities or new involvement in the sport after the summit?
Yeah, like I said, because of the fact the communists didn't really allow their players to leave, it wasn't until the 1990s that like the Russians actually started coming over and joining the NHL and making it truly like a global league, which arguably made the league much better, because instead of having like we talk about the fighters playing, you got like these skilled Russians playing, and that boosted. Like I said, growing up, my first favorite player was Pavel Bure, who came over from Russia, and if he wasn't allowed to come over, I probably not would have been as into his hockey as I was growing up. But So things like that I think are quite important, and like even today, like some of the best players in the NHL are European or specifically Russian players, depending on what your stance on some of these players. But I think just things like that, and like the Summit Series led to continue throughout the rest of the 1970s and 80s international terms between like not just Canada, the Soviet Union, but a couple of the other top teams like the United States and Sweden and Finland, and Czechoslovakia. They play a irregular tournament. They called it the Canada Cup, and it was just a similar idea. Like the top NHL players and top players from like the Soviet Union and whatever other league, they'd play each other, and just as a kind of quasi Olympics almost, and that became very popular. I mean, a lot of people argue some of these games were some of the best hockey games ever played. So I think those were quite big impacts.
To kind of draw us toward the conclusion, I understand the Stanley Cup has an interesting history. I don't understand. I never quite understood the legends around it. But every time, everybody gets very, very excited every time something was to happen. Could you explain the Stanley Cup?
Yes, the Stanley Cup is the championship trophy of hockey, at least the NHL now. It was donated in 1892 by Lord Stanley, who at the time was the Governor General of Canada, the Queen's representative. So he came over to Canada and he saw hockey being played. Remember, it was just a few years after it really like took off, and he became quite a big fan. And his sons, who are adult aged, and actually his daughter as well, I'll mention, to go back to women's hockey, were quite big hockey players, and they actually formed their own team at the Governor General's mansion in Ottawa, the capital. And so Stanley went and got someone to go to England and buy a small silver bowl that he was going to donate as a championship trophy of Canadian hockey. And in a great irony, because he had to leave because his politics in the United Kingdom, he had to leave Canada the year before the Stanley Cup was first awarded, so he never actually got to see his trophy awarded. But it became eventually the leading trophy in hockey. And among other things, the trophy has grown from a small little bowl that you could fit in your hand to a 35-pound trophy that's about 3.5 feet tall, because every championship, the winners on each team, every winning team, their players are engraved on the side of the bowl or the rings underneath it now.
Mm-hmm.
So like you can look back, and I mean they've had to recently take off some of the top rings from the older players because it can't grow forever, obviously, but you can look back 50, 60, 70 years and see names of long past legends. And especially in the early years, some of the stories with the cup, I mean, because when it was smaller, there's stories of it being driven around in a car in the 1920s to a house party, and then on the way back, the car had a flat tire, so they all had to pile out, and in the middle of fixing the tire, someone forgot the Stanley Cup on the side of the road. Another time, some guys were drunkenly walking past the Rideau Canal, which is a major canal in Ottawa, and which freezes over in winter. And these guys, again, like they had a few beers in them. One of them bet the other he could kick the cup across the canal, which is not exactly an easy feat. And he did not manage to kick it across the canal. It landed right in the middle of it, so they had to go fetch it off there. It's been thrown to swimming pools on more than one occasion. Every year, it's become a tradition now. Players or their young children will eat like breakfast or dinner or some meal out of the bowl itself.
What?
At least one child, more than one, I'm sure, has been baptized within the cup itself. There's been several misspellings on the cup, on like the players' names or the team's names or something like that. There's actually a case where one name has been X'd out because he was not supposed to be on the cup. I could just go on and on about that. It's quite incredible. And the current practice now today is after the team wins, every player gets 24 hours to take the cup wherever they want and do whatever they want with it, as long as there's one of the guardians. There's two guardians, trustees as they're called, that were first appointed in 1893, and they've just been succeeded since then. One of them's always with the cup, but to make sure it stays safe for these players, they get 24 hours. So it's traveled around the world. I mean, it was in Russia this summer because the captain of the recent team was from Moscow. It's been to France, Switzerland, Germany, all over Europe. It's been across Canada, across the United States. Mm-hmm. And the players are pretty much free to do whatever they want. A lot of them like host big like community gatherings because hockey at its base is a very community-oriented sport. So like these guys will bring it back to their hometown, have a big party, a big parade. Everyone will get a picture with the cup. Although the tradition also is, unless you've won the cup, you're not supposed to touch it. So, although I will admit, when I was younger, I got to stick a photograph of myself, and I did touch it, but I don't expect myself to go and win it anytime soon. So, I'm pretty safe on that.
That's amazing. I had no idea, like the whole history and the stories of like the misadventures of the Stanley Cup.
Oh yeah, it could be a whole nother podcast, honestly, just the stories behind the Stanley Cup.
So my last question is, what do you think listeners can take away from the history of either the summit or like hockey in general? What can we learn from the history of hockey?
Well, one, I think it shows to some degree just the history of Canada. I mean, like, again, this is going to sound really Canadian, but in my undergrad, I took more than one course titled Hockey and the Canadian Identity, which just showed how hockey and Canadian identity are intertwined. I mean, you can't really look at one without looking at the other. I mean, that's a big factor. I mean, the history of Canada the last 120 years is very much entwined with hockey to some degree. I mean, as Canada expanded west, hockey followed it west. As Canada grew more diverse and less English and French, hockey players became less English and French. As women became much more like part of society, they also did in hockey as well. And it's just things like that are very important. And just looking at the Summit Series again, it just shows this Cold War was not just about politics and fighting each other in proxy wars. It was also very much a civic thing and thing involving society. I mean, Canada didn't exactly have a big army during the Cold War, but we fought the Soviets in our own way, and that was by bringing our sticks out on the ice and literally slashing one of the Soviets in the ankles at one point. But it just shows like there's more than one way to like show the different like national identities involved with it and how different countries reacted throughout the Cold War, I think.
Well, I think that's perfect. You've kind of given us like what the importance of hockey is altogether. And but I know with anything like this, and I'm sure you'll receive many questions from your fellow Canadians, there will be some follow-up questions in Ask Historians. So I hope you will come along and join us there to answer any more follow-up questions.
Oh, I'd love to. It's nothing I like more than being able to write up a nice answer on hockey history. It's unfortunately not something that's too popular, but please, I love follow-up questions on something like that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matt. This has been great. You have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot for letting me talk.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.